So what is the drug war? The war on drugs, on its most basic level, describes the United States federal and state efforts to decrease the drug trade. This implicates the fight against the production and distribution, meaning importing and exporting of drugs, to, in the end, reduce drug consumption. From the local to the federal level, the government uses methods such as SWAT raids, tear gas, and no-knock raids to minimize both the supply and demand of drugs. However, these methods often risk the lives of officers and agents, as dozens have died in just the past decade and are partially responsible for the 1033 program. The 1033 program, authorized by the National Defense Authorization Act for 1997, allows for the transfer of surplus military goods, 5.1 billion as of last year, including weapons to local police departments. Such weapons include ammunition, M16s, grenade launchers, infrared scopes, mine-resistant vehicles, bayonets, creating a paramilitary force indistinguishable from a war zone overseas where the real enemies are. Thus, the war on drugs has created an environment in which law enforcers are put in enhanced risk and, in an effort to militarize the police, have created a more hostile environment for Americans.
As stated by the American Civil Liberties Union, quote, even though paramilitary policing like SWAT teams were created to deal with emergency scenarios such as hostages or barricade situations, the use of SWAT to execute search warrants in drug investigations has become commonplace and made up the majority of incidents the ACLU interviewed. When the police are executing a search warrant, there has been no formal accusation of a crime. Rather, the police are simply acting on the basis of probable cause to believe that the drugs will be present. Quote, there is no criminal case, no formal suspects, and often little, if any, proof that a crime has been committed. It is simply an investigation. Thus, the use of a SWAT team to execute a search warrant essentially amounts to the use of paramilitary tactics to conduct domestic drug investigations in people's homes. Quote, the majority, 79%, of SWAT deployments the ACLU studied for the purpose of executing a search warrant, mostly commonly in drug investigations. Only a small handful of deployments, 7%, were for hostage, barricade, or active shooter scenarios. Our investigation has found that in the majority of deployments, the police did not face any genuine threats to their safety. Furthermore, the drug war has not affected all people equally. For example, in 1986, Congress responded to the crack cocaine epidemic by mandating that sentences for crack cocaine be 100 times more than powder cocaine, since crack was apparently 100 times more addictive. Since crack is more popular among black users and powder more popular among whites, the law resulted in a disproportionate amount of black inmates compared to whites who use the same drug. Statistics show that African American drug users represented 35% of all drugs-related arrests, 55% of convictions, and 74% of people imprisoned on drug charges. This is disproportionate because African Americans only made up 13% of drug users.
Mr. Johnson, a theology teacher at Loyola, explains, quote, I grew up in Palos Verdes, which is a fairly rich community and was surrounded by some degree with drug culture. I had remote acquaintances who were classmates of mine in high school and college that used drugs, and I knew one who was incarcerated for possession charges, end quote. This is a stark contrast to black communities where many people have had friends and family incarcerated, as 1 in 5 African Americans will get in trouble with the law because of drugs. Although the government has fought the drug trade since the early days of the 20th century, what we know today as the war on drugs took root in Nixon's presidency. In 1970, President Nixon implemented the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act and named drug use to be, quote-unquote, public enemy number 1 the following year. He did this because of new information showing that around 15% of soldiers in Vietnam were addicted to heroin. He then created the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, which could conduct raids on the national level, while the 1972 enacted Office of Drug Abuse Law Enforcement fought drug trade at the street level. The government's actions became even more aggressive in 1978, authorizing civil asset forfeiture. This allows officers to confiscate the property and assets of people charged with drug charges. This is one of the major instances where civil liberties were sacrificed in the name of fighting drugs. However, 10 years and 2 presidents later, the incarceration rate had barely increased. This was soon to change. By 1980, In President Reagan's first year, drug arrests had risen by more than 125%.
From this point on, there have been 800,000 people arrested and incarcerated each year for marijuana charges. This means that for marijuana alone, 32 million people over the past 40 years have had their lives and careers ruined for victimless crimes. Does the imprisonment of this many people really make society safer? Is it really worth the cost?
To prevent further deaths and ruined lives, the war on drugs must end. The most significant first step to accomplishing this goal would be to decriminalize drugs, especially marijuana. Doing this would, 1. Decrease gang violence and police deaths and shootings, especially along border states. 2. Increase government revenue when they tax it, as seen in Colorado, which has taxed over $50 million from marijuana in the just first several years. 3. Lower the incarceration rate,
which is the highest in the world and would destroy less people's lives and careers, and 4, result in less ODs since the quality would increase from regulated businesses due to high standards as compared to gangs. In conclusion, the government's implementation of the war on drugs has not solved the problem of drug use and distribution. Instead, the war on drugs results in the destruction of millions of people's lives for victimless crimes. Therefore, in the interest of civil liberties, Americans must be allowed to regulate what enters their own body as they own it. Following this philosophy, the U.S. would save billions of dollars and, more importantly, respect the natural rights of man.